Welcome to 101. I'm Greg Bassett, your host from the Salisbury Independent newspaper. It's a big day here at PAC 14. We've got a friend of mine in the house, Dan O'Hare. Welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
I wanted you on because I wanted to promote your book,
Thank you.
Tell Me the Truest Thing You Know. And people love this book. And it's an incredible, not an autobiography, but it talks about you and your dad is the theme of the book and things that you guys learn from each other. Tell me, what's this about?
So it's a memoir that I wrote after my father passed away. I didn't know at first it was a memoir. I was trying to sort of put down his stories. I was dealing with a lot of anxiety, depression, and grief. And I didn't know what was what with those. And I started therapy and decided, I thought, somehow I need to record this stuff. And so I started with these stories, and I didn't like where it was going. And then I decided I need to make it honest, really, really honest. And I think the impetus behind this was I was convinced I was going to have a stroke like my father. And my father had a stroke in 2015. And it took 3.5 years for him to pass away. And in that time, from the moment he had a stroke, for that 3.5 years, he was a different person. He couldn't watch TV, he couldn't read, and he was mean and largely took it out on me. And his best moments, his most lucid moments, he asked me to kill him. So it was awful. It was a terrible time. And I have a young child, and I didn't want her to have that be the last memory of me. So I thought at some point these stories about my dad became, maybe these are stories about me that I'm leaving behind, and this like sort of information I can leave behind for my daughter about who I was and what, if anything, I've learned in this life.
Well, your dad was a real dynamic guy. He was a lacrosse coach down at Ocean Pines. What was his name?
His name was Matt O'Hare. He wasn't a lacrosse coach. He was an athletic director.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, he was athletic director at Worcester Prep for 38 years.
Right.
And he brought lacrosse to the Lower Shore.
Right.
Years and years ago, Andy, SU, Andy Jones,
Right.
went to Dad and said, "We need a feeder program. You guys should, play lacrosse." And he gave us a bunch of old sticks and helmets and stuff.
And that Worcester Prep program is one of the elite still programs anywhere.
Yeah, they're good. Yeah, my father wasn't familiar with lacrosse at all. I came from the Midwest, and he had me work as a ball boy for soccer. I'd run along the side of the field because soccer is safe, So for lacrosse, he only had like 6 balls for the team, and so he had me as a ball boy for lacrosse and go stand behind the goal. He didn't think it was a problem because no one on our team knew how to shoot very fast, but the ref saw it, and he's like, "That kid's gonna get killed." He's like, "Move." So then he gave me a helmet. He thought that would solve the problem, as he brought over a helmet, and the ref's like, "I have to stop the game." He's like, "Absolutely not. There's people who can shoot are gonna kill this kid." Yeah. So it was funny though. He gave me a stick to stand back there and kind of go get the balls and bring them back because they had literally only had 6. He had no idea what he was doing, And I put it in my left hand because I played baseball, and you catch with the left hand in baseball. Right. So I didn't know I put it in my left hand. I just put it the way that made sense for me. And it wasn't until I was in first grade, kindergarten when this happened, and it wasn't until my 6th grade year where the coach said, "Put it in your right hand," and I'm holding it in my left hand, and they're like, "No, your right hand." I'm like, "Oh," like, "Oh, this works too," which really was a benefit for me. So I was able to play with both hands. My dad had no intention of doing that, but it worked out really well. So, yeah.
But he's a dynamic guy, and he's the kind of guy, it might have been difficult to be his son no matter what.
Yeah. He was a great father, and there were moments where he wasn't, It's probably true with every father, I assume. It was a different time, in those times. So he was a very angry person a lot of times, and he had part of the book. What I talk about in the book is, without a doubt, he had undiagnosed mental illness, or undiagnosed other than from his 2 sons, my brother and I. we attempted to diagnose it a lot, but he definitely had rage issues, a lot of rage issues, and anyone who knew my father knew he could yell.
He was a loud guy.
Yeah, he was. He sure was. Yeah. So, but funny enough, I coach now. I coach soccer and lacrosse, and one of my freshmen this year said he couldn't hear me. Coach told him to do something, he didn't do it. I'm like, why didn't you do it? He said, I couldn't hear you, coach. And everyone else on the team goes, oh no. I was like, you'll hear me next time, I promise. So I did pick that up from my dad, but yeah, he was loud. He was dynamic. He was very intelligent. He directed the theater, so he directed plays and musicals at Worcester Prep for a long time, and he really loved that. So he was an interesting guy, but yeah.
So with my own dad, okay, so you and your wife have a baby. 11 months after the baby's born, your father has the stroke, and then he's incapacitated for 3.5 years, which is a long time for lots of emotions to go in all different directions. But I remember in my own life, there were so many things about my dad that I didn't understand why he did things the way he did them, and I was very resentful. And then I had a baby, and once I became a dad, then I understood things in a completely different way. And it helped me, not forgive my father so much, but helped me understand the decisions that he had made, like watching myself change through my son growing up. So you're in the same sort of situation, but 11 months in, your dad kind of punches out and becomes this other guy. So you didn't have that sort of thing that I had. So I really feel bad that you weren't able to evolve with your dad by having a kid. Does that make sense?
It's sort of one of the interesting aspects of the timing of when it happened was that my daughter's brain was developing at that point, right? She's just learning how to talk. She's really like that first 2 years. It's unbelievable how these kids explore, and you see their brains develop and how they start understanding stuff. At the same time, my father's brain, was an incredible brain. He was a very intelligent person, was devolving, and quickly. For a second it got better, and then it got worse. I mean, it never got better, but
right.
He woke up from being unconscious.
Right.
Got a little bit better, and then it got worse. So it got me thinking a lot about the brain, and it got me thinking a lot about personality. It got me thinking about who we are as humans. This idea of an individual or as a human, and what that means. And my father was a different human after the stroke, a different being, a different creature. After the stroke, and we're different people than we are when we're 1 year old. Like we are. We're different people than we were a week ago.
Right.
We just don't think about that. And so part of writing this book was putting down what I know to be true and what that truest thing I know of who I am is, in case something like a stroke takes that away from me. Because I have this sense that I don't believe in free will, and I don't go too deep into that book. I promise. I cut that chapter out, but I do think there's an element of agency we have, and how much of it depends on what we do with our lives, and depends on how we're born and our luck and all these other things, but that can get taken away really quickly, as it did with my father. And that's basically what happened. His agency got taken away. He didn't have control over his mind anymore in any way. So
one of the things I suspect, and I could be way wrong, but all my friends said, your dad is so great. You're so lucky to have him as your dad. And I was always like, yeah, if you want him, you can have him. I don't feel lucky at all.
I got that, but not from my good friends.
They knew better.
Friends, yeah, they saw. Yeah. So, almost all my friends knew my father, because they got yelled at by him,
which is a bonding experience in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Sure. But because he was at school, when I got to college, everyone's like, "Dad's great," and I was like, "It seems like that now because we're 1,000 miles away from him."
Right.
But like
when he stops in to visit, he's great.
Right.
Yeah.
But
takes everyone to dinner or lunch. Yeah.
Sure. Exactly. Yeah. It's so much fun. It must have been so much fun to grow up with. I'm like, fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. But he was great. I mean, he was a great dad. He was in a lot of ways. There's no question. And he was there a lot, which is important. I think the the thing that a lot of people are talking about now is how much more this generation of adults, parents, is around for their kids than the previous generations. But it happened to be because we went to his school, and after school we went, we stayed with him while sports practice happens or whatever. He was around a lot, like for us, he was there a lot. So that's good. A lot of kids don't have that, and I'm not in any way, this book is not in any way like, oh, woe is me. I barely talk about that kind of stuff in the book at all. What it's much more about is mental illness and my own mental illness and understanding it, the where my anxiety comes from and different ways to deal with anxiety. And, through writing this book, I lost 80 pounds.
Right.
I got very healthy through this process. And weirdly, one of the best parts about writing the book was it's this weird comfort. Like when my anxiety comes up and I'm like, oh, am I going to die now? Because I have a twinge in my chest from, working
Like a
out or
classic
whatever.
panic attack, or
Not a class. I don't have the classic panic
Yeah.
attacks anymore. I did. At one point, I knew all the emergency room doctors.
right?
But I did go through a lot of panic attacks, especially early in COVID when I started having all these problems, which I talk about in the book. But just a twinge in my chest or whatever, in the past, I would develop these panic attacks, and now I'm like, well, I got the book, so I'm fine.
Right.
It's a comfort to me. It really
Well,
is.
with my own anxiety, I don't know what triggers so much of it, but there's so much childhood trauma stuff that if I delved into it, it would take therapists decades to sort through this. So I just ignore it all. So the idea that you could write a book and kind of ferret out some of that stuff I think it's really kind of cool. And maybe I should do the same thing myself. But then I also think, is it really worth it?
It 100% is worth it.
Like coping is just better and easier and just have a drink instead of like really try to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, so I did that for 20 some years, and Scotland ran out of scotch. So I would say it's 100% worth it. Because that is what I did, and it won't take decades to go through. It took me 2 years. I'm not done.
But I don't want to know. I don't want to know.
I have this deep need to know things, I think. So that's part of the problem, is that I if I have a fear, I want to face it. If I have a curiosity, I want to satiate it. I need to know why things are what they are. So I'm glad I went through it, and it was similar to when I ran for office. Like, I'm glad I ran for office. I'll never do it again. I'll never go through that experience again. But I learned a ton. Or when I made a documentary about Salisbury, I learned a ton doing that, and I'm glad I did it. Doesn't mean I think it was fun necessarily. It was an experience that I learned a lot, and I know more about myself, and I'm happy I did it. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't like, oh, it was a breeze. It was painful, and it. So yeah, for 20 some years, I tried to drink and smoke away, all those feelings, and then when my daughter was born, I was like, I probably should stop doing all this, and then I had no coping mechanisms left for those feelings. That's something my therapist pointed out to me, actually, is it's 100%, what you just said there is very astute. If you're doing stuff, you're not thinking about, your anxiety. So, when you see someone who's like, God, that person's always doing things, they've got anxiety. You just go ahead and assume they do.
Yeah,
that's how they do it.
They're working in their yard, and it's just everything's a little too perfect.
No, or just those people that are on 12 different boards and do it and constantly moving stuff. They're burying their anxiety down. But it's a healthy coping mechanism sometimes.
And the alternative is you can't get out of bed.
Yeah.
You guys bonded over sports. My dad and I, even when we couldn't talk about anything, we could always talk about sports.
Yeah, it's big.
Talk about that. The Orioles were big in your life.
Yeah, so the Orioles were huge in my life. My dad took me to Orioles games at Memorial Stadium, and it talks about it in there of he had a whole process and where we went, parks. My brother doesn't care about sports at all, and so
what's the age difference?
2 years older than me.
Yeah, he's old. Okay, so you're the baby. Okay.
Yeah, so he didn't care about sports at all. So he would we'd go up to Inner Harbor. He'd get comic books so he could read them through the Orioles game, and then my dad would take me to the games. And And I think I was 18 or 19 years old before I found out he was a Yankee fan. I had no idea. I had no idea that my father
So he played
a
along
lifelong
for your
Yankee
sake.
fan. Yeah, he just kept quiet about it. Or if he said stuff, I just ignored it.
Right.
You know, I was shocked that he was a Yankee fan when I found out, and he explained why, and it's in the book. I mean, he grew up in he moved around a ton, but at one point he lived in Denver, and there was a minor league team,
Right.
Denver, and it happened to be like at that time in the 50s when all these greats, you know, went on to win multiple World Series with the Yankees. So even though he was living in the Midwest, he was a Yankee fan, you know. But because he was only in Denver for 2 years, those 2 years there. So, and most of the time in Indiana and that area. So. Yeah, a huge baseball fan, and when I left, when I was 18, I left Maryland, and I was gone until, you know, right before Olive was born. So I was gone for over 20 years, and I never lost the love of the Orioles. That was kind of the thing that you know, tenuous, you know, line to Maryland that I always had
Right.
was the Orioles. You know, every year for a good portion of the year, you know, I was still a Marylander, you know, because of the Orioles. And meet people along the way in life that were Orioles fans. I forgive all the other things they do, so it's okay. They're an Orioles fan, like, you know. I remember when I was at college, and you know, we're at the football game, national anthem, and I do an O, and there's another person does an O, and we're looking in the crowd to see who it is. We're like, do I know him? I don't. I'm gonna meet that guy, you know. So it's, you know, those kind of things, like they're weird how they're those special things or something that like my father taught me, and it gave me a sense of home when in any other way I didn't have it, you know. He and my mother divorced, and it was kind of a bad divorce after I had graduated college. Or sorry, I never graduated college. After I graduated high school, I was in college, and I was kind of in the middle of it, weirdly. I was just having to be home when it happened. And it led to my father not speaking to me for a year and awfulness. And
Did you have to take sides? Was one of those things?
no, I didn't have to take sides. I didn't take anyone's side. But
that bothered him maybe that you didn't take his side?
no, it was just a mental illness thing. Like he was just somehow, he connected it to me somehow. My mom wasn't there for him to take it out on, so he took it out on me, even though I wasn't there either. And so, it was very strange how that ended up happening. And so I felt, you know, like I didn't have a home. You know, I didn't have a place to live. Dropped out of college, and I lived in Indiana for a little while but then ended up moving to Europe and living in Europe and stuff, and living in Ireland, and then came back and lived in New York. But the whole time thinking, you know, there's no real home for me. But that said, except during baseball season, you know, I would have that like sense of, you know, a place I came from that I loved, you know, so.
But you were flawed in one way. Eddie Murray was your hero. I don't know how anyone could have Eddie Murray as a hero. Jim Palmer was my hero.
There's nothing wrong with Jim Palmer.
No,
Jim Palmer is probably
Jim Palmer ended up being an idiot. As I grew up, I realized that he was just you know, he's not hero worthy.
He might be the smartest color commentator that's ever.
But he's so annoying as I've gotten older.
I love Jim Palmer.
And he, like I said, I had the poster.
Yeah.
You know, I love Jim Palmer. But Eddie Murray?
Yeah, God, Eddie Murray was. Eddie Murray's a bad man in the best sense of the term. You know, like it was interesting because I was growing up in the early '80s. You know, this was and Eddie Murray was still stuck in the '70s. You know what I mean? Like that mustache and that just him and Cal Ripken. Oh man, they were awesome. But being in the stadium as a little kid, and you know, hearing the entire stadium chant your name, Eddie, Eddie, must have been like that must have been the thing for me, like that, you know, to me that was the highest point of fame that I had ever seen anyone achieve.
Right.
the whole world was chanting his name. You
Yeah.
know, like for a 6-year-old, you know, everyone around you in a baseball stadium, that's the whole world. Like you can't conceive that there's more people
Yeah.
that exist than the people that are in that
Yeah.
stadium. And the stadium was packed chanting his name every time he came up to bat.
Yeah.
You know, like it was unbelievable. And you know, it seemed to be, I don't know if this is true, but it seemed to be every time I saw him play, he'd hit a home run or, you know, get an extra base hit for, you know, 4 RBIs and whatever. It just seemed like he always had these incredible games.
Bad segue back
Nah,
to your father's passing. Was he in a nursing home or what?
He was, yeah.
Okay.
So he was in, God, I think 3 or 4 different ones.
So were you the primary visitor?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like no one else wanted to go, or how'd that work out?
Surprisingly, a lot of people didn't want to go. My mom went a lot. So my mom and dad divorced 25 years before my dad passed away. But my mom did more to take care of him than anyone else in his life, including me. She bought him all his clothes. She helped, you know, scout out different nursing homes and do a bunch of stuff. She really stepped up, even though they were not close anymore. You know, before my dad had the stroke, he would see her at Thanksgiving and maybe once around Christmas, and Thanksgiving at my house, wherever I did Thanksgiving, you know, and when I was in New York or here, and then maybe around Christmas briefly, but that was it.
But there was a lot of burden on just you.
Yeah. Yeah, there was. You know, my mom did a lot of the work, you know, in terms of getting stuff, but, you know, I in a lot of ways, he was very different around my mom than he was with me. And so I was a primary caregiver, I guess, is the best way to put it.
How does that affect you even today?
Well, that kind of regret,
Yeah.
I think, is something that leads to a lot of grief, right? I think that or grief leads to regret, one of the two. There's definitely a symbiotic relationship those two have. And one of the people who's read this book, read it twice actually, the only person I know to read it twice, she spoke to me about it and about her mother, you know, and I don't want to name who it is because, you know, but and how her mother was trying to tell her something and how she was, and a lot of people cry when they read this book, which is why people don't want to read it. I don't blame them. But it's not, they're not crying over me and my dad. They're crying over their own experience.
Right.
You
I'm
know?
here talking about myself,
Yeah,
you know, more than
exactly.
even about your dad. But go ahead.
Yeah. But that's the thing. Like that's
what makes it work.
So to segue into something completely different, my wife and I had a lot of problems with miscarriages prior to Olive being born. And when she got pregnant with Olive, we decided that she was working these long 15-hour days at the Kelly and Michael show in New York. And it was like, you got to just quit your job, like move down to our vacation home in Salisbury, which is why we moved down here, and give it a chance, like give this a chance. And so we had all our friends from New York came to our going away party, and we told them, you know, Caroline's pregnant and we're moving out of town. And they said, we didn't even think you guys wanted kids. And like, we did. We just, you know, we had 4 miscarriages. And they're like, we had miscarriages too. And these were my best friends in the world. And I was like, why haven't we spoken about this? Like, why don't we talk about these things? And that's something that was sort of an impetus for doing this as well, is that some reason we think we don't need to speak about these things and keep them pent up, and then, you know, every once in a while it'll come out with something like this or whatever. But so yes, to get back to what you're saying, I don't, writing this book caused a lot of people to tell me their stories about their parents and end of life. And a lot of my friends are going through this now or have gone through it. And it's different with every single parent. It's different with every kid who's dealing with it. But one thing that's almost universal is this sense that like we didn't do it right. You know, like it was just like we could have done something else or whatever. And it's as if, you know, there's a class on this, or as if there's like practice we can do or
Right.
something. You know, like of course you don't do it. Of course you're gonna feel like, you know, you're not perfect at something you've never had to go through, which is quite possibly one of the more traumatic things in your life. You know, if all goes correctly, like if everything works out well, you're gonna bury your parents, right?
Right.
Like that's supposed to happen, you know, and
Yeah,
yet
when your father or mother look at you and go, "Am I going to die now?" No one's ever taught us how to answer that question.
yeah. Or will you kill me? You know, and that's you know that's
And again, I don't know if I want to know, but
Yeah.
I can't wait to read about it. That's the reality. I
Yeah.
don't want to be a burden to anybody.
my dad made that joke as well, and he also he made the joke that please pay the nursing home attendants not to abuse me, kind of thing. He used to always make that joke, you know. And when he had the stroke, I went to every nurse change at the hospital. He was there for 18 days in the hospital, and I brought snacks to the nurses, you know, just to make sure they didn't abuse them. And I didn't think they would, but the way that information is transferred to the hospital, you need to be an advocate. Like you
Right.
just absolutely, someone needs an advocate or else. It's mostly transferred verbally. And so I would go to the meetings and correct them because I had notes and stuff. And, you know, I was like, no, actually the doctor did this, you know, like, and not that they were doing things wrong. I don't want to imply that, but like, you got tons of patients and all different, sometimes he's in that section for 2 days.
Sure.
The nurse has only seen him once, you know, whatever. And so I would go to these nurse changes twice a day for 18 days. And the first day I brought like, you know, donuts and apples and some fruit and other fruit and stuff like that. And the nurse is like, you don't need to bring the fruit. Keep going with the donuts though. So it was like, I would get it sugar. Sugar's the answer. But yeah, my father, I know my dad didn't want to be a burden. No one does, you know, but at the same time, when you're in that situation, you know, I often talk about how when the brain surgeon came to us and said, you know, if we don't operate, your dad's going to die. And I asked her to like lay it out logically for me because, you know, I like logic, or a version of it. And so I said, can you tell me like what the risk is? And they're like, well, there's a risk if you remove the clot that will cause more brain damage. And I was like, well, is the clot going anywhere? Is it happening? She's like, no, it's not going anywhere. It is what it is. And I was like, well, can he, you know, repair it, his body repair it himself? She goes, it's possible, but not probable that will happen. And I said, okay, well, but, you know, do we know that like removing it will help? She goes, no, I don't know necessarily that will help. And I was like, so why are we doing this? And she's like, because he'll die if we don't. But it didn't logically make sense. And so my family's like, you got to do it. He'll die. Well, he'll die if you don't. I'm like, but it doesn't logically make sense. Like it could repair, it could, you know. And I talked to a nurse about it, and she's like, how are you going to live with yourself, you know?
But maybe it's time.
And knowing now what I know, if I had a time machine and could go back and tell myself, don't do this, let him pass away, I still know I wouldn't have been able to make that choice. I still know in that situation, I still would have told the doctor to operate, you know. And that sucks, you know, because that's you know, you're like, I didn't choose for my dad to be tortured. You know, I chose to give him a chance, but sometimes that's choosing for him to be tortured, you know, and that's just awful. So I don't dwell on that in this book, I promise. There's stories about baseball and lacrosse.
But Dan, by writing this, and you've admitted your own vulnerabilities, and it allows all of us to express vulnerabilities that we share and things that we share. So I thank you for that. And here's the book, Tell Me the Truest Thing You Know by Dan O'Hare. How can I get a hold of this? I know I see it on Amazon.
It's on Amazon, yeah. Bethany Books has it.
Dan, thanks so much for being here
Hey,
today.
thank you for having me.
Thank
Appreciate it. Such a pleasure.
He's Dan O'Hare. This is his book. And I'm Greg Bassett from the Salisbury Independent newspaper. Another edition of One-on-One right here on Pack 14.
First Shore Federal is proud to support PAC 14 and one-on-one. We'd encourage every business to support PAC 14 and pick a program and support it, and let's make a difference.